Hey guys, today we're going to cover managing database relations in the back end. These are concepts that will be useful for the developer. We'll be building a customer management tool, or CRM, that uses some inbuilt features of October's back end and leverages Laravel's approach to models called Eloquent. These are features you won't find in your typical CMS and are really what sets October apart as a platform. Here is a simple diagram that shows what we're going to build. It gives a visual representation of the relationships that we'll need. As you can see, the star of our CRM is the opportunity. This is a place to store all the opportunities that the business may create for itself. An example could be creating a website for a client. The opportunity should have some kind of status to track its progress. The first status could be initial contact, for example. As the opportunity progresses, we can move through different statuses, but it can only ever belong to one status at any given time. We'll also need some way to create notes about the opportunity, like entering information about a successful meeting. Notes belong exclusively to the opportunity, so we'll need to use the inverted relationship where the opportunity has many notes. An opportunity can also be made up of offerings. An offering is a service that the business provides, such as logo design or web development. These things together can help give an estimate on how much the opportunity will cost. And finally, the opportunity needs to be associated to one or more contacts, which are reused. So if there is a contact called Jim, we only enter Jim's details into the system once, and these details can be reused for other opportunities in the future. This reusability is achieved with the belongs to many relationship type and is used by both the offering and the contact. There's also one more thing to note here. On the offering table, the retail price, cost, and the owner all have an asterisk next to them. That refers to pivot data, which means when this particular offering belongs to this opportunity, we may want the option to override the retail price, the cost, or even the owner. And this is done using the pivot table, but we'll get to that in just a moment. To get started, I've already created a plugin called Acme CRM. I've also created models for each table in the previous diagram. So we've got contact, note, offering, opportunity, and status. Then I've made a seed script that will populate some sample data. Now we need to create a controller in the back end, so we have a page to view and manage our opportunities. I can quickly create one by running the artisan command create controller, and this will go in the Acme CRM plugin, and we'll call this controller opportunities. And you can see that's gone and created the controller for us in the file system. I've also added a link to the plugin registration file that references the controller that we just created. So that will give us somewhere to go when we open the backend. So let's click the navigation link that we registered to open the controller that we just created. By default, the controller will be pre-configured to use the model of the same name. So this page has already picked up the field and column configuration that we have defined for our model. And we can see the form fields by clicking on the New Opportunity button. The only fields shown so far are fields that are not relations, so things like the opportunity name and also the content. And you can see those fields defined here in the Models directory under Opportunity. There's the opportunity name and also the content. But what about the relations? Those are currently defined in the opportunity model down here. So you can see we have the relation of status, notes, contacts, and offerings already defined in our model. So now we need to add the related fields to our form field definition. First, I'm going to show you some more basic relation form field types. So let's start with the status and offerings relations. So we'll copy those and then move over to the form field definitions file. If we add both of them in here and give them both a label, all we have to do is give them the type of relation. October will automatically know what type of relationship it is and display the necessary control to manage that relation. So let's save it and go have a look. Now in the back end, if we refresh our opportunity form, you can see that there's two new fields here, one for the status and one for the offerings. And you can see it also has the seed data that I showed you back from before. Now it's simple enough to select a status and maybe select some offerings as well. And that's how easy it is to translate your model relations into form fields. But what if we have heaps of statuses, like heaps of statuses, maybe like 1,000 statuses? A drop-down will become too clunky here because we're not going to be able to pick from 1,000 different statuses from this list. There's a different control we can use instead, called the record finder. This is an alternative to the drop-down and is useful for selecting from massive amounts of records, such as users. So let's go and replace this status field with a record finder. All we have to do is change the type here for the status field to say record finder. This field type has a few additional options that we need to define, but you can read more about that in the documentation. First, we'll need to give it a list for the list column definitions, and we'll reference our own plugin here. This refers to the column definitions for the status model. We also need to define a prompt to say click the icon button to find a status. We also need to define a name from option here, so we'll call that name. Now if we save this and then refresh our back end again, you can see now we have a record picker form field. The way this works is you click the icon to the right and this opens up a list that allows you to search through the thousands and thousands of records. We don't have thousands of records, we've only got 7. But this is just an example of how this would work. So let's select a status, we'll go with first contact. And you can see that's been locked in. Well, you might be thinking, what about offerings? What if we had thousands of offerings to choose from? Well, we need a more robust solution called the relation controller. You may be aware that controllers, like models, implement the use of YAML files. By default, you'll get a config form file and a config list file. To implement the relation controller, we'll need to add another one called config relation. So let's go and do that. And what I'm going to paste in here is taken directly from the documentation, except I modified it so it works with the offerings relation. Again, following the documentation, we need to modify our controller so it supports the use of the relation controller behavior. So we do that by adding a reference here in the implement section, and we also need to add a reference to the relation configuration file, and we do that here. This activates the new behavior in our controller so it's ready to use. And if we open the view file create, which is the page that we were looking at before, all we have to do is just render the relation like this using relation render and then the name of the relation that we'd like to render, in this case offerings. So let's save this. Now if we refresh the back end, you can see that the control's rendered here. And so here's the difference between the simple control and the more robust control, which is the relation controller. So all we do is click add offering, and you can see now if we had thousands and thousands of offerings, you'd be able to search for them and select them like this. The next thing we should do is replace the old offerings control with the new one. And that's relatively simple to do as well. All we do is take this relation render code that we wrote here and then paste it into a new partial file. So we'll create a new file here and we're going to call this file field offerings.htm. Then if we paste that code into this partial, all we have to do is return to our form field definitions for the opportunity, and then instead of using the relation type, we can use a type called partial. and that's going to also take a path option, and the path should be the file name that we chose, which was field offerings. And let's check that out. So if we refresh again, you can see the old offerings control is gone and it's been replaced by our new relation controller. So just as a side note here, I just want to explain what deferred binding is. In October, there's a unique system baked into the models called deferred binding. It allows you to attach relations to models that don't exist yet. So in this case, we're creating an opportunity and it doesn't exist, yet we're still able to add offerings to it because we have deferred binding. So after we create this opportunity, give it a name, you can see that the offerings are still there. That's because the relationship binding was deferred until after the model was created. And I think that's a pretty cool feature. So moving right along, we've added the status and the offering to our opportunity. Now we need to add the notes and also assign it to various contacts. We can do both of those things using the relation controller as well. We'll start by adding our other fields to this config relation file. So the first thing we'll need to add is the notes. I've pre-prepared this config, and as you can see, it's very similar to the one above, except that notes belongs to the opportunity, and the opportunity has many notes. So that's slightly different in terms of the configuration, but you can view the documentation and it has examples for every different relation type. We also need to add a relation for the contacts, and the difference between this one and offerings is we have a create button, and that's pretty much the only difference. So now that we've added those to the relation config, we can save it, and then we need to create the partial files for each one as well. So I'll create one called field notes, and that will render the notes relation. And I'll create one called field contacts, and this will render the contacts relation. So with all those partials in place, all we have to do is add them to our form. So the notes, we'll use the notes partial, field notes, and we'll probably want to put this on a tab, a different tab called notes as well. And for the contacts, we do the same thing. Call it contacts, and the field is contacts, and that can go in a tab of the same name. Now let's return to the back end and then refresh our opportunity. And you can see now we have two new tabs, one for notes and one for contacts. So notes is pretty straightforward. You can create notes, so we'll enter a subject, and the note also belongs to one of the back-end users, so that was logged by me. And you can create as many notes as you like here. And so the only options you have here are to create notes and also to delete notes. And that's because all the notes belong to the opportunity. Contacts, on the other hand, is a bit different. With contacts, we may have contacts that already exist. So we have the option to add a contact. So we could add Jim and Wes. But we also have the option to create a new contact. So we can enter new contact details. We also have the option to remove a contact. This is different from deleting a contact. And that's because contacts are reusable and they don't belong to any model in particular. And so there you have it, a fully functioning CRM manager where all the relations are kept within the same form. That really is quite a simple way to manage your complex relationships and models. However, there's just one more thing we need to do. And remember back at the diagram here, we had these asterisk signs that suggest that this needs to belong to pivot data. So we need to add the pivot columns to our offering model. Let's go and do that. So you can see in the table where we create the opportunities, we have these pivot tables, and these are what mediate the relationship between the opportunity and the offering, for example. And you can see here we have these additional pivot columns. We have the price, cost, and an owner ID. This data belongs exclusively to that relationship and that relationship only. And so in order to make this data available, we need to open our opportunity model and then find offerings. Then we need to add a new argument here called pivot. And inside here we just need to feed it the column names that we're going to be using for our pivot columns. Once we've done that, the data will be available through the pivot relationship. What we do now is open up the relation config again, and then we need to add a new item here called pivot, and then move the form option under this pivot item. And what we can do under here is define our fields directly. So we might like to add pivot price. And when we first open this pivot, we're going to need to give it a default value. And so we want to take the default from the base price. We should also do the same thing for cost. Now the relation controller will detect that we're using a pivot form, and it will display accordingly. So let's refresh our page and have a look at that. So here you can see we've got a copywriting entry. If we click on that, the price and the cost are both 0. And that's because the pivot data is currently 0. So we can now override the price and the cost to something that is contextual to this relationship. And that occurs when we add a new offering as well. So if we click add offering, and we're going to go with logo design, you can see the default values have come from the base offering, and we're able to lower our price, for example, for this particular opportunity. Now you might notice in the list here, the overridden values are not appearing. So we need to modify the list configuration for this table as well. So back at the relation config again, what we want to do here is change our list columns to include the pivot data instead. So we can get rid of the reference to the YAML file and include our columns directly. So now we're still displaying the base name, but now we're displaying the pivot price instead of the base price. We could, if we wanted to, include the base price as well by just including a column called price, and that would be the base price. I've just noticed these two are around the wrong way, so I'll just fix that as well. Okay, so as you can see here, we're using the base model values and also the pivot model values to display our list. So let's have a look at that now. And if we refresh the page again, there we go. You can see there's the base price of 80 and the discounted price of 70. So we have the option now to change the pivot data against the original model. But you might also remember the requirement was to have an assignee or an owner for a particular offering. That's going to take a little bit more work because the pivot data at the moment is very basic. We can't necessarily have relations in our pivot model. Or can we? October has a method of defining a custom pivot model for the pivot data. And I'll show you how we do that. You create a new file or a new model, and let's call this opportunity offering pivot. And so this class needs to extend the pivot base class instead of the model base class. and this model will be returned for our pivot data. So all we have to do to implement this is go to our relation definition and define a pivot model like this. So now when the pivot relation is accessed, it will be in the form of this class. And the crazy thing about this is now our pivot model can also have relations. So we can define an owner for the pivot for the contextual data for the other relationship. And that's pretty mind-blowing stuff, but I'll show you how that works and what that looks like on the front end. So the next thing we probably want to do is move these ugly references here into their own files. So in our models directory, we'll create a new folder that matches our pivot model, which was opportunity offering pivot. And then we should create fields and columns here that we can use. Then we can transfer the definitions that we made here into these new files. So we've got our columns and our fields that were related to the pivot. And so we can also just reference them now as files, which was opportunity offering pivot columns and opportunity offering pivot fields. Now that we have a dedicated space for our pivot fields, what we can do is set up a relationship field type. So we'll say pivot owner, and this will be of the type relation. And so this will just be a basic relation field like I showed you at the beginning of this presentation. So now when we return to the back end and have a look at one of our offerings, you can see the relation field now shows up. So we can pick a new owner for this particular offering. We're now reaching the more complex side of what's possible in October as a platform. And that's where we'll finish up today. So I hope you enjoyed watching this presentation, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.